Good morning, and a very warm welcome to all of you. It's a great pleasure to host this event today for the German Council on Foreign Relations, DGAP, here in Berlin. My name is Guntram Wolff, and I'm the director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. And today we want to discuss Ukraine's Independence Day and the prospects for Ukraine, both in terms of its security and reconstruction. Before I start introducing, let me thank the organizing team that helped put this together, in particular Dr. Jan Stöckmann and Julia Loeva, and many other colleagues who worked diligently to make this morning briefing happen again. And it's the first morning briefing after the summer break. So very warm welcome to all of you again. On August 24 in 1991, the Supreme Soviet of the Ukraine, SSR, adopted the Act of Independence, reestablishing Ukraine's independence. Today, we are celebrating the anniversary, and it's a special anniversary because the Independence Parade is not an Independence Parade of Ukrainian tanks, but of Russian destroyed tanks exposed and exhibited in the center of Kiev, showing the whole difficulty of the situation. We will talk about the military situation, but of course, also we want to hear about yesterday's news, namely the fact that Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, apparently died in a plane crash, and you know what all of that means for the military and the security situation and the long-term future of Ukraine. We have a stellar lineup today, and so I want to welcome our three speakers. First, let me welcome Your Excellency Oleksii Makeiev, the ambassador of Ukraine to Germany. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Let me also welcome Ambassador Anka Feldhusen. She was the German ambassador to Kiev, to Ukraine, for the last couple of years until very recently. And last but not least, let me welcome my colleague András, who's a senior fellow at the German Council on Foreign Relations and a security expert. It's great to have you all with us. We want to start with an update of the military situation and hear from András Rácz. Then His Excellency will give us his perspective. And last but not least, Anka Feldhusen will give her perspective. And of course, then we want to engage with you, our esteemed audience, and hear from you your questions, your remarks, and engage in a conversation with you. So thank you so much for joining us for this morning's morning briefing. And András, over to you.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you, Guntram. Thank you, dear Excellencies, for joining us today morning. As usual, my job here is to provide a brief update on the military situation based, of course, only and exclusively on open sources. In order to make our life easier, please allow me to share a map, because maps usually make it easier to picture the actual frontline situation. So right now, I'm trying to share a map. This time, we are not going to use the map provided by the Institute for the Study of War, but another map, because this one is better for picturing the situation, that particularly on the southern front line. You do see the map, right? Perfect, thank you. So let's start from the north. Russia's offensive up in the Kupiansk region, and despite massive Russian information efforts to picture this offensive as something decisive, something which has a capacity to break through, in fact, it doesn't. So the offensive is largely stagnating, mostly because Ukrainian defenses are very hard here. Lots of minefields, properly prepared defense fortifications first, and second, the terrain is extremely complicated. Third, Russia here lacks the necessary artillery, armored, and mechanized forces to achieve a real breakthrough. Even if they reach Kupiansk, which is kind of a worst-case scenario, Kupiansk is a properly fortified city with, again, a complicated terrain behind, or actually inside the city. So even if Russians reach Kupiansk, it's unlikely that they could achieve any bigger breakthrough than that, particularly because the river Oskil running here is an important and heavy natural barrier to pass. So despite what we read in Russian state media sources, this Russian offensive at Kupiansk, it's causing serious hardships for Ukraine. There is heavy fighting going there, but I do not really see that any breakthrough would come there from the Russian side. Going further south, of course, extremely heavy fighting has been taking place around Bakhmut. Since our last morning briefing, Ukraine regained considerable territories, both north and south of the city. So right now, heavy fighting is going on, particularly at Klishchiivka. Terrain here has both the attacking side and the defending side. So here the fighting is intensive, but in strategic scale, it's mostly stagnating. This is the same thing is expected to continue. By regaining these territories marked green, there are hills around Bakhmut, and by recapturing, liberating these hills, Ukraine has fire control over most parts of Bakhmut, which makes the life of the Russian defenders fairly complicated there. Still, Russia has considerable forces here defending Bakhmut, so any quick Ukrainian success here is unlikely. Nevertheless, Ukraine is steadily, slowly moving forward. The most interesting section of the front line is, of course, the Zaporizhia front line, so the south. Here, there are dynamic changes in two sections of the front line. One is called the so-called Velika Novosilka axis. So heading further south, this axis would point towards basically Mariupol or Berdyansk. Here, last week, Ukraine managed to liberate the small settlement of Urozhaine. Here, the week before, another small settlement on the other side of the river Mokriyale, so pushed back the Russians into their first prepared defensive lines. Why this is important? Ever since Ukraine's counteroffensive has begun, there have been a lot of speculations about the Russia fortification lines and how strong they actually are. So far, the fighting has been going on not at these fortification lines, but in front of them, the so-called perimeter zone. And here at the Velika Novosilka axis, Ukrainian forces managed to reach or almost reach the first Russian real fortification lines. So now we will see a live test of how strong these fortification lines in fact are. The most important section is not this Velika Novosilka, but the other axis, the Orehiv axis. Here, Ukraine achieved spectacular successes in the last 2 weeks. It was confirmed yesterday by the Ukrainian government, but from open source information, it was known already for 5 days that Ukraine managed to liberate the village of Robotyne. Moreover, Ukrainian forces managed to break into the Russian lines between Robotyne and Verbove. This map is a fairly conservative one. So between Robotyne and Verbove, there is a major gray zone where the Russian forces are gradually getting pushed back. From open source, it's impossible to define where exactly the front line is. Still, the number and composition of the Russian forces here indicate that Moscow tries to stabilize the front line, but doesn't really have available extra reserves to get deployed here. This map is also good because it identifies the Russia units fighting. It's a very interesting pattern here. All these Russia units, what you see here, are so-called BARS units, meaning reservist units, except 2 downgraded motorized rifle regiments. So what we see here is that Russia is trying to hold the first line basically by weak, understaffed reservist units, while the second line of defense here is held by guards units. So the classic Russian strategy is getting manifested here. In the first line, you deploy weaker units, and if they collapse under the enemy pressure, then the second line with more experienced units is supposed to hold up the enemy's advance. Here at Robotyne, Ukraine clearly has the momentum. This is a significant penetration into Russian defensive lines. I expect the fighting to get significantly more intensive and also dynamic here in the upcoming weeks. So dear colleagues, if you're watching only one section of the Ukrainian of the front line in Ukraine, I think this is this Orehiv direction to watch. At the same time, Ukraine is able to launch smaller probing type of attacks again across the river Dnipro as well. It's unlikely that Ukraine could establish a real bridgehead here, because crossing the river and establishing the proper logistics is a complicated thing. But still, even these small probing attacks serve the purpose of making the Russians divide their forces. So Russia has to choose which finger to chew, whether to fall on a rock on a hard surface, to deploy their reserves along the Dnipro, or deploy their reserves to the Zaporizhia front line. So Ukraine clearly has the initiative here in the southern front line. And a few words about Prigozhin. By today morning, it's confirmed that both Wagner owner Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead, and also the Wagner founder Dmitry Utkin is also dead, together with other lower-ranking Wagner commanders. What does it mean for Wagner as an organization? Most probably the surviving Wagner commanders will now be less reluctant to accept the offer of the Russian Ministry of Defense to sign up for them for ministry subordination. So the Wagner Group as an organization with a considerable autonomy, so the Wagner Group as we knew it is coming to an end quickly. Still, this doesn't mean that private military companies would disappear from Russia's inventory, because Moscow still needs the ability or the capability provided by these private military companies, namely to deploy military force in a covert way. So the real question is not the fate of Wagner anymore. The real question is what comes after Wagner and after Prigozhin in Russia's inventory. So that's it from me for the start. Thank you again for joining us today. Over.
Yeah. Thank you so much, András, and this has been really very useful. Let me just get one very quick follow-up question. I mean, so we saw the map, we saw all the details now, but if you were to zoom out, and now we have sort of the map switched off, what do you make of sort of the overall situation at the front? I mean, you saw that some American anonymous sources were saying, well, basically the offensive is stagnating and it's unlikely to succeed. And then others are quite optimistic still. So if you were to give an educated guess, where are we with this offensive, counteroffensive?
This is an interesting question. I'm trying to give kind of an educated guess. When the counteroffensive started, after 2 weeks, Ukraine considerably changed its strategy and tactics, because it turned out that the initial approach didn't work. But since then, for 11 weeks, Ukraine has been consistently conducting the present strategy and tactics. No further changes, meaning Ukraine clearly assesses that this approach is going to work. Because had they been assessing that this approach has been a failure, they would have changed it already. Still, Ukraine is consistently pushing, and we have open source information on Ukraine deploying now its best equipped and best trained brigades here at the southern front line. So what I can say with a proper level of certainty, that the Ukrainian military leadership is consistent and firm about the rightness of the strategy they are using. And so far in the last 18 months of the war, they committed no serious strategic mistake. So I don't really see the reason why would now they start suddenly failing. So I don't know what's going to happen. I know what Ukraine has been doing, and I know that they have been doing it quite consistently. And one more thing, it's too early to judge the results of the counteroffensive, because at least 2 more months are left of it, or possibly 2.5, before the major autumn rains arrive, the Bezdarozhye or Rasputitsa period. So it's just too early to judge. We need to keep watching and keep supporting Ukraine.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, András. And now is, I think, the right the right moment to turn to you, Excellency, to hear the perspective from Ukraine and from the embassy in Germany. And as András already said, of course, the continued support of Ukraine is something that is extremely important for success and is something that also the German ambassador today again reaffirmed. And I think also we at the German Council on Foreign Relations have been very supportive and pleading for more military as well as financial support to Ukraine. So we look very much forward to your remarks and comments. And again, happy Independence Day today.
Thank you, Guntram. Thank you, András, for your presentation. the key to understand the situation is, of course, the work of experts, of NGOs, as German foreign relations, and reports from the front line, from great journalists who opened the eyes of the people all over the world. Well, proceeding from what András showed us on the map, I hope you understand that this is not something, that this war is not a kind of strategy, a computer game where you move forces and then look for results. Looking at the situation from the trenches differs your perception a lot. Let me quote to make you understand, to make the German audience understand the intensity of fights. One of the military commanders who briefed the ambassadors of Ukraine at the conference 2 weeks ago, he said, just for you to understand, we can compare the situation on the front line and the fortifications of the Russians, Russian occupiers, with the fight on Zeelov Heights, close to Berlin, at the end of the World War II. You need to understand that Russia has an intensive mine-laying and multi-layered defense, extended up to 40 kilometers on the front line. The whole front line to be dealt with for Ukrainian armed forces is about 3,800 kilometers, including the destroyed border with Russia and another aggressor state, Belarus. In the recent weeks, well, since the beginning of the counteroffensive, we gradually move forward, 11 settlements, and over 250 square kilometers were liberated. But what you said on the support, well, it is key to provide Ukraine with modern, effective Western weapons system to make sure we defend ourselves and we progress on the front line. I'd like to remind you the air defender training here, military drill here of NATO forces in Germany, to remind you what has been trained. It has been trained how the air forces deal with the attack on the land, with intrusion, with overtaking port infrastructure, and this is exactly what has been trained here in Germany. But you need to understand that we have no air superiority, and the air defense systems provided by our Western allies is not enough to save all the civilians in the major cities of Ukraine and to provide this support to the frontline brigades trying to get through Russian defensive lines. So we need clearly more air defense systems, and our partners know it exactly. But we also need to establish the air superiority to cover our advanced troops on the front line. This is why it is so appreciated that during the last visit of the presidents, Zelensky to Denmark and the Netherlands, we have been promised the F-16 jet fighters will be provided to Ukraine, and our pilots started trainings. All over, we think, and with the information of our general staff, over 260,000 Russian troops were eliminated in Ukraine. You have all the access to this official information. And when I was talking about air defense systems, well, Anka Feldhusen may provide you with her feelings, what is all about to live in the city of Kiev, which is well protected with the air defense. You need to understand that since the start of the full-scale invasion of Russia, they launched over 6,500 missiles and over 3,500 tag drones against Ukraine, mostly aiming for civilian objects. And in the city of Kiev, where my parents live, my friends and colleagues, there have been over 800 air raid sirens in a bit more than 500 days of the war. So you need to understand how it is to live in Kiev and to be constantly shelled by the Russians. So this is about the military situation, and for my introduction, and I would be happy to get into the Q&A session and answer your question, your audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your update and your points, very important points. I cannot resist asking you at least one word about the Taurus Marschflugkörper. You know, where do you see that debate? How important is it really?
Well, sometimes I hate the word debate because if you translate it from German, it's something which lasts for half a year without taking decision. And I do expect that the whole Taurus debate would go much quicker than the Leopard debate. What I can say that we are really practical and pragmatic in talking to our German partners, explaining why we need this or that type of weapon. And I can assure you that the whole discussion between our political and military leadership and our allies in Germany, United States, United Kingdom, France, by the way, United Kingdom and France provided you with the same type of weapons without having any escalatory effect on the situation. We clearly explain why it is needed, and well, I completely agree with András. The strategy is being adopted as we discover new elements. Like, for example, what would you do when you figure out that the mine fields are sometimes 40 kilometers bright? So you need to get through, and it's just you cannot overfly it because you don't have your airplanes. You can use your longer range of artillery, but once again, this is the job of the engineering forces to demine it, and this sometimes means crawling down the field and demining so the troops can move forward. So this is a war in the trenches, but also strategically, it is something that we always communicate with our allies to update a strategy or to request other types of equipment which are needed.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for your reply. Ambassador Feldhusen, thank you so much for joining us this morning, and over to you.
Good morning, everybody. Yeah, and since I'm the last speaker, I try to be brief. Oleksii gave me a kind of good kickoff point. In May this year, my team and we looked at the statistics of the Air Alert app that we all use. And we realized that my team and we had spent 3 entire weeks in protective rooms since we came back in May 22. This is a long time to spend in shelters, believe me. Yeah, and hearing a ballistic missile shot down right over your head is very impressive. And it is something I would not have wanted to live and had not expected to live. I think where I can contribute something to this panel discussion is the fact that I have been in Ukraine not only for the last 4 years as ambassador until July 23, but also as deputy ambassador from 2010 to 2015. And that made me, from the start, convinced that Germany would continue being Ukraine's most reliable partner. Also, in this war, the war that actually started in 2014, and having been in Ukraine twice when Russia attacked Ukraine was also something that I had not expected to live. So yes, I was always convinced that we would be Ukraine's most reliable partner and continue being it. At the Zeitenwende speech by Olaf Scholz on the 27th of February 22, who laid the political groundwork for that. It was, of course, a complete change in German foreign policy, 180-degree change, which resulted in the fact that we are now also delivering weapons, weapons that have made a difference, as Oleksii pointed out, especially in air defense, but also on the battleground, and sometimes also weapons that are less get less attention, like bridge laying tanks that are very important, and the Gepards that came early on in early summer 2022 have made a huge difference in the fight against drones that Kiev was attacked with as of October last year. And that was it became very quickly very clear that these Gepards are a very effective weapon against the drones, so that Kiev, as Oleksii already said, became a very protected city. Yeah. But still, it is impressive seeing these air alerts there. Also, what we have never to forget is, even though, yes, Germany is now the second biggest supporter also in terms of weapons to Ukraine, this is the real war going on. Soldiers and civilians are dying every day, despite the efforts of the partners of Ukraine, despite mainly the efforts of the Ukrainian air defense and the Ukrainian soldiers in the trenches. And that is why I saw my main function in this last year in trying to relate the sense of urgency that the Ukrainians and the Ukrainian leadership has in wanting more modern weapons in order to defend their country and in order to protect their citizens and their soldiers. This was something that I tried to focus on, knowing very well that we were doing really, really a lot. And let me point out something that has perhaps not been so well known, but even before the Zeitenwende, Germany and Ukraine cooperated very, very intensely in the field, in the medical field between the armed forces. Ukraine actually modeled its medical service of the armed forces on the one that Germany has. And perhaps that is a little bit of irony of fate, but already in 2014, I realized how important modern field hospitals would be, so that the Ukrainian soldiers would get very good, that they would be looked after correctly medically in the first, as they say, golden hour after they were wounded. Yeah, the irony of fate is that modern field hospital that Germany acquired from Estonia for Ukraine came in the very first days of the full-scale war in the beginning of March 2022. And this has saved life. And one of my last trips was to Dnipro, where I met the head doctor of one of the most important hospitals for the care of wounded Ukrainian soldiers. And he did tell me that they arrived at least in a slightly better state than in 2014 when the war started. So I am, of course, happy that the relations between Ukraine and Germany, also in the fields of weapon deliveries, have become reached a level that is appropriate for our relationship. Nevertheless, it was always a joint effort with our partners, with the United States, with Great Britain, with France, and many, many other countries. But since this morning, we also wanted to talk about reconstruction. Perhaps one last word. I think one of Germany's biggest advantages was that since 2014, we had been supporting IDPs in the east of Ukraine with housing projects, with projects on mental health, but very importantly also with support for small and medium enterprises that were either founded or relocated by IDPs. And all these projects we could, without a break, continue to implement in Western Ukraine after the full-scale war started. And I'm convinced that during the reconstruction of Ukraine, Germany will also play its very big role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for these very clear remarks. And let me already say to our audience that you're welcome to put questions either in the chat or raise your hand, your virtual hand, so that we can pass on and let you speak and ask your questions directly. We of course always prefer if you actually want to speak in the chat. That makes it much more interesting for our speakers and more lively for the overall debate. If I can just ask one very quick last question to you, Ambassador, if you could just say a bit more about the fact that Germany is the most reliable, I think you said the most reliable partner, or one of the most reliable partners, and that we have now become the second most important deliverer of weapons. So has the ranking, so to speak, switched recently, and the UK has fallen behind us? Is that based on the Kiel statistics, or can you just say a word about sort of how you measure the reliability, in a sense, of the partnership?
Yes, and never forget that I left Ukraine in July, so I might not be completely up to date. But when I left Ukraine, according to the statistics of the Kiel Institute, yes, Germany was the second provider of weapons. That might have changed with the Storm Shadow deliveries by Great Britain. But as I said, this is a joint effort of Ukraine's partners, and it has always been kind of going up and down who provided which weapon at what time. As I said, we have delivered weapons that were game changers, like the IRIS-T system, and I'm happy that this will be our main focus also over the next months and probably years, so that Ukraine will in the end have 8 IRIS-T systems. Ukraine is a huge country. Kiev is well protected, but this other cities like Dnipro, like Odessa, like Sumy recently, they need protection too, so that the civilians can live more or less normal life, with more or less school for children, with working. This is still a huge effort to be that has to be made by the partners.
Okay, thank you so much. So we can now take questions, and I see that there is one question in the chat, which I will just read out by Peter Beschnitt. The Ambassador Makeiev, did I get it right that you said that Ukraine has air superiority? Where? I think that was probably a misunderstanding, but perhaps you want to clarify. And let's take a second question, Tobias Münchmeyer, and if we can bring you in the chat, that would be great, Tobias. Yeah.
Mr. Beschnitt, no.
Okay. Please, yeah.
We don't have air superiority, and this is why I made this comparison to air defender training. This is what we need to advance, and unfortunately, the number of aircrafts Su-24 and MiG-29 are inferior to the Russian aircraft like Su-35 in terms of range. And the range of their weapons. So we need that air superiority, attack helicopters and F-16 to support our troops on the ground.
Thank you for clarifying. So let's get in the speaker, Julia. Can you bring, yes, here, Herr Münchmeyer, yeah, please.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Tobias Münchmeyer. I'm a project lead for Greenpeace in a project which is called Green Reconstruction of Ukraine. And I greet you from Kiev, and I would like to ask a question to Mrs. Ambassador Feldhusen. If I would be grateful if you could characterize the dialogue and the cooperation in the field of reconstruction in Ukraine. We all know there is the Reconstruction Ministry, but there are also key figures, key politicians in the presidential administration, that there are important ministries like the Ministry of Energy, Ministry of Environment, Ministry of Economy, of course. And I would be grateful if you could characterize a little bit the way how you, in your term as ambassador to Kiev, were cooperating with the Ukrainian government on reconstruction efforts. Who is taking, in your view, the lead? Who is the institution to establish a dialogue with the questions like that? Would be very interesting for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that question. Of course, something that I've already pointed out, we have a long-term history of cooperating with Ukraine. So perhaps for us, it was actually easier because we had contacts everywhere, in all the ministries that you mentioned. The German embassy was actually really, really big before the war. Unfortunately, we came back with a small team, but we had learned during the pandemic to also work online. So I think we were in a kind of lucky situation that we had partners in all the ministries, that we could continue with our cooperation, with our projects, almost without a break, as I said, especially in terms of helping IDPs. Now, in terms of reconstruction and especially energy, already through the winter when Russia targeted Ukrainian energy infrastructure, we tried not only to help quickly, but we also already tried to help so that it would be more sustainable, meaning going also into a green direction. One of my most favorite project sphere was always when we delivered solar panels and battery storage for social infrastructure, for little polyclinics, for schools, so that they would be independent, at least most of the time, from energy supply from the grid. This is the future, and already before the full-scale war, we had started to work intensively with the Ministry of Energy on the issue of hydrogen, green hydrogen. And despite the full-scale war, these projects have been going on, also between private companies, but also with the help from our government. And the latest is the creation of a kind of think tank, the Green Deal Ukraine, that was set up by the Helmholtz Institute, which is meant to continue this work on trying to make the Ukrainian energy system not be reconstructed in the old way, but to make a jump to green energy. And I think this is where Germany can play one of the biggest roles.
Thank you so much. So also for mentioning this recent Helmholtz think tank initiative, which is co-led by a former colleague of mine, Georg Zachmann. So I'm happy to hear about that. So let's take a few questions. I will read 2-3 questions from the chat, and then perhaps we can collect a bit and also bring in Carsten Vogt to ask a question directly. But let me start with the chat. So Eva Tenzin is asking to His Excellency Makeiev, when it comes to the liberated territories, what are the main activities of the Ukrainian government in order to improve the situation of citizens living there so that they do not feel left behind? How can international partners be of any help? And then perhaps related to that, a question also to you, Excellency, by Anton Friesen, about your strategy, Kiev's strategy to win the hearts and minds of the people of Donbas, still with autonomy and cultural rights. And Yes, and then there was a question perhaps to András on the importance of cluster ammunition and whether it made a difference in the battlefield. And the second question also to you, András, about the weak morale and motivation of Russian troops, and how is it possible that they can actually still resist the counter-offensive? That was a question by Henna Ehringhausen. And let's bring in Carsten Vogt with your direct question. And I think, Mrs. Feldhusen, for you, the question, let me read the question to you also by Gemma Pörtzgen. How do you see domestic politics in Ukraine? Are there concerning developments in the country which go in the wrong direction? So I think that's a nice set of questions, but let's bring in Carsten Vogt, and then I think we have a nice set of questions for each of you.
Carsten Vogt. I have been, in one function of my life, I've been the founder of the German-Ukrainian Forum. That's a long time ago. First, let me thank you, Ambassador Feldhusen, for all the work you have been doing as Gesandte and as ambassador. This was remarkable. It was remarkable because you were among the first who learned Ukrainian in the Foreign Office, which was not very typical at that time of our relationship. My question is directed in the direction of domestic policy and the German domestic foreign policy, because foreign policy and security policy is always influenced by domestic events. And do you see any specific problems which might come up because of the presence of more than 1 million Ukrainians living in Germany? And many of them are living here with their families and without their husbands. Very often, problems which are developing there spill over in the perception of the foreign policy debate. And do you see any problems there? And do you see, as ambassador of Ukraine, any problems on the horizon which might come up, or what we could do better in the context of our domestic policy relating to Ukrainians living in Germany?
Thank you so much. So I would say, Anka Feldhusen, we start with you in reverse order, then Your Excellency, and then András.
Yeah, very briefly, thank you for your kind words, Carsten Vogt. I have mainly been living in Ukraine, so it's hard for me to judge how the million of Ukrainian refugees living in Germany here influence really domestic policy decisions. What I have seen, though, except for very few individual cases, that Ukrainian refugees have felt welcome in Germany, and the integration has gone, in the end, very smoothly. I mean, even Berlin, and you know how often we make fun about Berlin. Ukrainian children were introduced into the school system. I was there last year before the school year started. There were huge numbers of Ukrainian children. 2 schools even started now education in Ukrainian in Berlin alone. So I think our effort to welcome and to integrate this million of refugees was really, really very, very good. So I'm curious to see what Oleksii thinks about that, but I'm not worried about that. I think the main importance is, and Ukrainian refugees can play a huge role in that, is to keep the interest and the attention to this war up in German society, because this will influence German domestic political decisions. The problem with an ongoing war, and I've seen that after 2014, other issues come up, other problems, other challenges, and people continue to live their life. But this is a huge war, very comparable to World War I or II, in the middle of Europe. And we need to continue to make the German society understand that it's in our interest to help and support Ukraine long-term so that Ukraine wins this war.
Thank you.
Mr. Wolff, I'm really humbled, and I'm really happy about the level of support by the Germans towards my Ukrainian countrymen. This is something that I feel from the very beginning of my tenure here since October last year. I've been touring the country, and I figured out that actually we have here in Germany not some 50 diplomats in our mission here in Berlin and in general consulates all over the country. We have over 1 million diplomats, because those people contribute to winning hearts and minds of the German people. And this is something which I call on Ukrainians and on Germans: share your stories, because actually this war left no person in Ukraine unrelated to this war. And every Ukrainian has a story on surviving, has a story on everyday struggling with and on everyday fighting. Members of the families, unfortunately, lost their lives, and we have friends in the front line. We communicated with them every single morning when we wake up, and this is really something which would forever stay in the hearts of Ukrainians, to be hosted, to be protected by the Germans, and to be welcomed. And I do hope that as soon as we get through the defensive line and liberate more territories, those Ukrainians would come back home. And answering one of the questions, what the government does in the liberated territories, let's look at the city of Kherson, who was occupied by Russians and was liberated last fall. People start coming back, because Ukrainians value this feeling of being home. Of course, everybody has different understanding of what security is. Some people can allow to come back to the frontline region, but the government comes with the assistance of our partners, with providing medical assistance, trying to renew the infrastructure like water supply. We don't have any problems with food supplies to those regions, and this is the first thing that our government and the armed forces do after liberating the villages and the cities. And we start rebuilding infrastructure, not waiting till the end of the war. And this is maybe a bridge to the further discussion why reconstruction is key, and why reconstruction must be dealt with not in years or months, but now.
And Your Excellency, can you say one word about the Donbass also? There was a question about how to win back the hearts and minds of the people in Donbass.
Well, that's a serious question. Not only Donbass, but also Crimea. You need to understand that since 2014, people live in the occupation with the whole Russian propaganda, and even in your question about cultural rights and autonomy, this is also something which Russia has been playing with since the very beginning, as if there were problems with cultural rights, as if people in Donbass wanted autonomy from Kiev. So first, this is not true. Second, we need to deal with that issue. And once again, as ambassador of Ukraine to Germany, I always try to draw parallels between the situation in Ukraine and Germany, or the after World War II situation in Germany and Russia. And in this case, we need to learn lessons also from Germany. So we in Ukraine, after liberating all our territories in some 30 years, do not see people of Donbass voting for AfD, for example. This is where we need to learn better German experience.
That's right. Thank you so much. So, let's, András, let's bring in Hans-Jochen Schmidt just to ask his question also, and then come to the questions. Please, Herr Schmidt.
You referred, Professor Guntram Wolff, to the latest articles published in the New York Times concerning the strategy and the criticism. And somebody answered the question of what is the significance of effectively supporting Ukraine in defending itself. And one of the probably aims should be to destroy supply lines. How would you consider, what is at the point of view very much criticized inside Germany, for example, to use cruise missiles to destroy, for example, the Kerch Bridge as one of the examples, the most symbolic one in a certain way, to reach success? And the other, Carsten Vogt, you referred to the domestic factor. And that is more or less for, unfortunately, the Ukrainians and the embassy not so easy to convince the minds and hearts in Germany. If you start here a debate about migration flows and the negative impact, as recently at the open house policy, like, for example, Lindner, that is very counterproductive from my point of view. And I think you suffer from the fact that, unfortunately, some of the politicians and the leading politicians, they are not willing to, to answer the question, why? Because of the delays in effectively supporting Ukraine, there are certain difficulties surfacing. And therefore, if we start to criticize the, not so successful counteroffensive, then we should think about why, because we are not willing to support Ukraine in a certain way effectively and in time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think, András, that ties nicely also to the other questions that were addressed to you. And if I can, since we have only 8 minutes left, there's one question which I think is sort of hasn't been asked yet by Christian Gröning here in the chat, and it's to the ambassadors. But I'm sure, András, you also want to say a word about it. Is a diplomatic dialogue possible to end this war, which is sort of a big question that resurfaces all the time. And I think we would all really like to hear from each of you what you think about sort of the end of the war and the possible diplomatic solutions. Gemma Pertzken is reminding us about domestic politics in Ukraine, and that might also be a point that you take up in the last round. So András, I would say we go to you, then Your Excellency, and then Anka Feldhusen, and then I think our time is up. András, please.
Thank you. I'm trying to be brief. On cluster ammunition, it helped the Ukrainian artillery to bridge the shortages of Western artillery shell supplies. So in short, by using cluster ammunition against Russian military targets, Ukrainian artillery can fire a lot more than it could before. And so far, Ukraine has used these shells in a very disciplined way. So not against heavily populated settlements, not against cities, but only against Russian military targets. When it comes to hitting the Russian supply lines, personally, I would be very much in favor of providing the Taurus and attacking the Kerch Bridge in order to cut the Russian supply lines leading to the Crimea. It looks like that this is actually the Russian strategy, the Ukrainian strategy as well, so to downgrade the capacity of the Kerch Bridge and eventually destroy it. And when it comes to the possibility of diplomatic solutions, yes, at a certain point, it will be the solution, but we are not yet there. The Russian side is clearly not ready and not willing to negotiate. The Russian strategy is evidently to tire out Ukraine, to break the Western support behind Ukraine. So Russia still thinks that it could wait out and win the war. And Ukraine, of course, is not ready to negotiate about any territorial concessions. So we will have diplomatic negotiations ending this war, but not yet. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, András. And of course, the question is when will we have it? Is it only when there's a different Russia and a regime change in Russia, or if Ukraine wins so decisively that Russia doesn't have a choice? Perhaps, Your Excellency, you want to also enlarge on that.
Yeah, well, this is not true that there are no diplomatic attempts. But what András said, Russia is not willing to having diplomatic negotiations. And well, unfortunately, we need Russia with military means to make sure they negotiate. So the more territory we liberate and put Russia into a position to go out from Ukraine and to liberate the occupied territories, including Crimea, the more are the chances that we find a diplomatic solution. But this is only the final resolution of this aggressive war of Russia. The president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, suggested the peace formula of 10 steps to deal with. And in the recent months, we managed to launch large-scale negotiations now on the level of the foreign policy advisors. Over 40 countries met in Jeddah several weeks ago to discuss 10 points of this peace formula. And we're working on organizing a global peace summit to get more countries around the table, not Russia, but more countries to be clear about what the final solution will look like. I need to say that the whole formula is reflected in the documents of the United Nations, and this compatible with United Nations Charter. So we are working on diplomatic solution, but unfortunately, to bring Russia to the negotiation table, we need to have progress on the battlefield.
Thank you so much. And Mrs. Feldhusen, please. You are muted, I think.
Yes. Perhaps on the diplomatic solutions, just 2 words. First of all, I witnessed how Ukraine gathered support around the peace formula in the last months. And perhaps to remind you, the presence of the Chinese representative in Jeddah was a major step forward. Also the activity of the Chinese embassy in Ukraine, in Kiev, but also the Brazilians, the South Africans. That was very interesting to watch in the last months of my tenure there. And I think it's huge progress that the Chinese are engaging in this. And I was happy for the Ukrainians to see that. Yes, I forgot the question about domestic politics. Sorry about that. I have witnessed domestic politics in Ukraine for a long time, and I think it was never the characteristic was never kind of what is a characteristic for Germany, perhaps consensus on what is wanted to be achieved, stability in the government. It was quite the contrary. Yeah, this said, I am impressed how solid this government has been working, yes, under Prime Minister Schmyhal since March 2020, and especially since the beginning of the full-scale war. There are very strong ministers that have made a lot of contacts with their foreign counterparts, like the Minister of Defense, Reznikov, that has built up trust. And I think for the time being, this government in Ukraine is well prepared to tackle reconstruction. Support for Volodymyr Zelensky, who has done an outstanding job in leading this country in this war, is great, is high. So yes, there will be hiccups again and discussions, but why not? All in all, I'm pretty optimistic about domestic politics in Ukraine, yes, that's it. And since I forgot, coming back to the diplomatic solution, I think one of the major issues there is trust. And I always wondered, can we trust the Russia that Ukraine is facing right now in keeping its promises?
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Your Excellency, Ambassador Makeiev, Ambassador Feldhusen, my colleague András, Thank you to the organizing team, and thank you so much to all of our listeners and active discussants. It was really a great 1 hour. I learned a lot, and I'm really grateful for your engagement and the good debate. Thank you so much, and until next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.